Number 1. Bernard Madoff, the Ponzi scheme that fooled Wall Street. Bernard Lawrence Madoff orchestrated what would become the largest financial fraud in United States history. A Ponzi scheme so massive and so meticulously crafted that it survived for nearly 2 decades while fooling some of the world's most sophisticated investors, charitable organizations, and financial institutions. Born in Queens, New York in 1938, Madoff began his career in finance in 1960 when he founded Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities LLC with $5,000 he had saved from working as a lifeguard and installing sprinkler systems. His firm grew to become one of the largest market makers on Wall Street, and Madoff himself served as chairman of the Nasdaq Stock Exchange, a position that lent him immense credibility and respectability in the financial world. Behind this legitimate business operation, however, Madoff was running an entirely separate investment advisory service that promised steady, remarkable returns to an exclusive clientele, returns that were nothing more than an elaborate illusion funded by new investor money rather than actual profits. The scheme operated with breathtaking simplicity at its core. Clients deposited money expecting it to be invested in securities, and Madoff's firm sent them statements showing consistent gains, typically between 10 and 12% annually regardless of market conditions, a pattern that should have raised red flags but instead attracted more investors who viewed the consistency as evidence of Madoff's genius rather than impossibility. What made this fraud particularly sophisticated was not just its scale, which ultimately reached approximately $65 billion in claimed account values, but the layers of legitimacy that surrounded it. Madoff's market-making business was genuine and highly respected, providing perfect cover for the fraudulent investment advisory operation, and he cultivated an aura of exclusivity that made investors feel privileged to have access to his services, often turning away potential clients to enhance the perception that his fund was selective and special. He employed what appeared to be a split-strike conversion strategy, a legitimate if complex options trading approach that few investors fully understood, which allowed him to explain his consistent returns with technical jargon that satisfied questions without revealing the truth. The fraud persisted through market booms and crashes, through regulatory examinations by the Securities and Exchange Commission that somehow failed to uncover the scheme despite multiple warnings from financial analyst Harry Markopolos, who had mathematically demonstrated that Madoff's returns were impossibly consistent and had submitted detailed reports to the SEC beginning in 2000. Markopolos called his findings the world's largest hedge fund is a fraud, and provided evidence that Madoff's strategy could not possibly generate the returns claimed. Yet regulators failed to act decisively, later admitting to numerous oversights and failures in their examinations. The scheme finally collapsed in December 2008 during the financial crisis when the market downturn led many investors to request withdrawals that Madoff could not fulfill, as there were no actual investments to liquidate, only a ledger of fictional profits. On December 10, 2008, Madoff confessed to his sons Mark and Andrew, who worked in the legitimate side of his business, telling them that the investment advisory business was all just one big lie and that it was basically a giant Ponzi scheme. His sons immediately contacted federal authorities, and Madoff was arrested the next morning at his Manhattan apartment. The investigation that followed revealed the staggering scope of the fraud. Victims included individuals who lost their life savings, charitable organizations that were wiped out, and institutional investors who had failed in their due diligence. Among the victims were Holocaust survivor and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Elie Wiesel's foundation, which lost $15 million, actor Kevin Bacon and his wife Kyra Sedgwick, New York Mets owner Fred Wilpon, and numerous charities and pension funds. The human cost was immeasurable. Several victims committed suicide after learning they had lost everything, including Madoff investor René Magan de la Villahuchet, who was found dead in his Manhattan office, and Madoff's own son Mark, who hanged himself in his apartment on the second anniversary of his father's arrest. Federal prosecutors charged Madoff with 11 felony counts including securities fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and perjury. He pleaded guilty to all charges on March 12, 2009, in a courtroom packed with victims and media. During his allocution, Madoff acknowledged that he knew his actions were wrong and criminal, stating, "I am actually grateful for this first opportunity to publicly speak about my crimes, for which I am so deeply sorry and ashamed." Judge Denny Chin, who presided over the case, called the fraud extraordinary evil and sentenced Madoff to the maximum of 150 years in prison on June 29, 2009, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The judge noted that the sentence needed to reflect the symbolism of the case and deter future fraudsters. Madoff was also ordered to forfeit over $170 billion, though the actual losses to investors were eventually calculated at approximately $18 billion in principal, with the rest representing fictional profits that never existed. The aftermath of the Madoff scandal extended far beyond his own conviction. His wife Ruth forfeited her claim to $80 million in assets and was left with just $2.5 million, living under an assumed name and largely shunned by society. His brother Peter Madoff, who worked as the firm's chief compliance officer, pleaded guilty to falsifying documents and served 9 years in prison. Several employees who helped maintain the fraud, including Frank DePascali, Madoff's director of operations who managed the fabrication of trading documents, also faced criminal charges, with DePascali pleading guilty to 10 counts but dying of lung cancer before sentencing. The court-appointed trustee Irving Picard worked for years to recover funds for victims, clawing back money from investors who had withdrawn more than they invested, a controversial process that forced some victims who thought they had legitimately profited to return those gains. Through these recovery efforts and the liquidation of Madoff's assets, approximately $14 billion of the $18 billion in losses has been recovered and distributed to victims, though this represents only a fraction of what people believed they had lost when considering the decades of fictional returns shown on their statements. The Madoff scandal prompted significant reforms in financial regulation, including enhanced oversight of investment advisors and improved whistleblower protections, though critics argue that the fundamental problems that allowed the fraud to persist, including regulatory capture and the tendency to defer to prestigious figures, remain inadequately addressed. Bernard Madoff was incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Institution in Butner, North Carolina, where he maintained for years that he acted alone, a claim few investigators believed given the scale and complexity of the operation. In various interviews from prison, he expressed remorse and attempted to explain his motivations, suggesting the fraud began in the early 1990s during a recession when he couldn't meet redemption requests and chose to use new investor money rather than admit losses, a decision that spiraled into decades of compounding lies. On April 14, 2021, Bernard Madoff died in federal prison at age 82 from chronic kidney disease and other ailments, having served less than 12 years of his 150-year sentence. His death brought little satisfaction to victims, many of whom felt he had escaped true accountability by dying before experiencing the full weight of his punishment, while others found some closure in knowing he had spent his final years imprisoned and disgraced, his reputation destroyed and his family torn apart by the consequences of his crimes. The Madoff case remains the definitive example of how trust, prestige, and the illusion of exclusivity can be weaponized to perpetrate fraud on an almost unimaginable scale, and it serves as an enduring reminder that even the most sophisticated investors and regulators can be deceived when they fail to question what appears too good to be true. Number 2. The Theranos fraud. When Silicon Valley Promise became criminal deception, Elizabeth Holmes founded Theranos in 2003 at age 19 with a revolutionary promise that would captivate Silicon Valley investors, the media, and the American public. Her company would transform healthcare by making blood testing faster, cheaper, and more accessible through proprietary technology that could perform hundreds of tests using just a few drops of blood from a finger prick rather than traditional venous draws. Holmes dropped out of Stanford University to pursue this vision, and her youth, combined with her stated mission to democratize healthcare, made her a compelling figure in the technology world. She cultivated a distinctive public image, wearing only black turtlenecks in conscious imitation of Steve Jobs, speaking in an unusually deep voice that some later claimed was affected, and articulating a vision of Theranos as a company that would save lives by making blood testing so convenient and inexpensive that people would catch diseases early. By 2013 and 2014, Theranos had raised hundreds of millions of dollars from prominent investors including media mogul Rupert Murdoch, Oracle founder Larry Ellison, the Walton family of Walmart, and former Secretary of State George Shultz, who also served on the company's board alongside other luminaries like former Secretaries of Defense William Perry and James Mattis, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and former Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist. The company's valuation reached $9 billion at its peak, making Holmes, who owned approximately 50% of the company, a paper billionaire and the youngest self-made female billionaire according to Forbes magazine. She graced the covers of business magazines, gave a widely viewed TED Talk, and was celebrated as the next Steve Jobs. a visionary entrepreneur who would revolutionize an industry through technological innovation. Theranos partnered with Walgreens pharmacy chain to place its blood testing centers called wellness centers in stores across Arizona and California, promising consumers they could walk in and receive comprehensive blood test results within hours for a fraction of the cost of traditional labs. The reality behind this glossy exterior, however, was that the technology simply did not work as advertised. The Edison machines, named after the inventor Thomas Edison, that Theranos claimed could perform numerous tests on tiny blood samples, were unreliable at best and dangerously inaccurate at worst, producing results that varied wildly from established testing methods and could lead to misdiagnosis and inappropriate medical interventions. As the company encountered persistent problems with its technology, rather than acknowledging these fundamental limitations, Holmes and her partner and chief operating officer Ramesh Sunny Balwani made the decision to perpetuate and expand the fraud by using commercially available blood testing machines from companies like Siemens for the vast majority of tests, while claiming to investors, partners, and the public that they were using Theranos' proprietary technology. They diluted the small fingerprick samples to create enough blood to run on conventional machines, a practice that further compromised accuracy, and when their own laboratory director raised concerns about the unreliability of results, those concerns were dismissed or the director was marginalized. The fraud involved multiple layers of deception. Theranos presented pharmaceutical companies with validation reports suggesting their technology had been endorsed by major drug manufacturers when those companies had actually found the technology inadequate and ended their partnerships. The company created impressive demonstrations for investors and board members using carefully controlled conditions that did not reflect real-world performance. And Holmes and Balwani made specific representations about the company's financial performance, contracts, and technology capabilities that were materially false. Former Secretary of State George Shultz, one of the company's most prominent boosters, was so convinced of Holmes's vision that he became estranged from his grandson Tyler Shultz, who worked at Theranos and became a whistleblower after witnessing the problems with the technology firsthand. Tyler Shultz, along with another former employee Erica Chung, provided information to regulators and to journalist John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal, who began investigating Theranos in 2015. Theranos attempted to suppress Carreyrou's reporting through aggressive legal threats and hired David Boies, one of America's most prominent attorneys, to intimidate sources and journalists, but on October 15, 2015, the Wall Street Journal published Carreyrou's first exposé revealing that Theranos was using commercial machines for most tests and that its technology was unreliable. The article triggered investigations by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and eventually federal prosecutors. In January 2016, CMS inspectors found serious deficiencies in Theranos' Newark, California laboratory, including problems so severe they posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. The regulatory walls closed in rapidly. Theranos voided 2 years of blood test results from its Edison devices, affecting tens of thousands of patients who may have received inaccurate medical information. Walgreens terminated its partnership and later sued Theranos for breach of contract, and in July 2016, CMS revoked Theranos' laboratory licenses and banned Holmes from owning or operating a laboratory for 2 years. The company attempted to pivot to a new miniaturized testing device called the MiniLab, but by 2018, with its credibility destroyed and facing multiple lawsuits and criminal investigations, Theranos dissolved. On June 15, 2018, federal prosecutors in San Francisco charged Elizabeth Holmes and Ramesh Balwani with 9 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, alleging they had engaged in a multimillion-dollar scheme to defraud investors, doctors, and patients. The indictment detailed specific false statements made to investors about the company's technology, revenues, and relationships with pharmaceutical companies and the military. Holmes and Balwani pleaded not guilty, and their cases were severed for separate trials. Holmes's trial, delayed multiple times including due to the COVID-19 pandemic and her pregnancy, finally began in September 2021 and became one of the most closely watched white-collar criminal trials in recent history. The prosecution presented evidence including internal communications showing Holmes and Balwani knew the technology didn't work, testimony from patients who received inaccurate test results that affected their medical care, and evidence of forged pharmaceutical company logos on validation reports shown to investors. Holmes's defense argued that she had genuinely believed in the technology, that any misstatements were not intentional fraud but rather the optimism typical of startup culture, and that she had been psychologically and emotionally abused by Balwani, who was significantly older and had controlled aspects of her life and the company. This abuse defense, supported by testimony from an expert on intimate partner violence, sought to explain how Holmes might have been manipulated into decisions and statements she wouldn't otherwise have made. The jury deliberated for 7 days before reaching a split verdict on January 3, 2022. Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts related to defrauding investors but was acquitted on charges related to defrauding patients and on some of the investor fraud counts. Judge Edward Davila sentenced Holmes on November 18, 2022, to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison, a sentence substantially below the 15 years prosecutors requested but far above the 18 months her defense argued for based on her being a mother to a young son and being pregnant with a second child. The judge found that Holmes had not accepted responsibility for her crimes and that the offense was serious given the breach of trust with investors who had believed in her mission. Holmes was also ordered to pay over $450 million in restitution to victims, though given her lack of assets, this is largely symbolic. She surrendered to begin her sentence at a minimum security federal prison camp in Bryan, Texas, on May 30, 2023, after unsuccessfully appealing to remain free pending her appeal of the conviction. Ramesh Balwani's trial occurred separately in 2022, and he was convicted on all 12 counts of fraud and conspiracy he faced, receiving a 13-year prison sentence in December 2022, reflecting the jury's finding that his culpability was even greater than Holmes's. The Theranos scandal had far-reaching implications beyond the individuals convicted. Investors lost approximately $750 million, and while the wealthy venture capitalists could absorb these losses, the fraud represented a broader betrayal of trust in Silicon Valley's fake-it-till-you-make-it culture, where exaggeration and optimism are often celebrated but rarely cross into criminal fraud. The case raised important questions about media credulity, as many journalists had amplified Holmes's narrative without sufficient skepticism, about the role of prestigious board members who lent credibility without exercising adequate oversight, and about the dangers of combining medical technology with the fast-moving, hype-driven world of technology startups where people's health is at stake. George Shultz, who died in 2021 before reconciling with his grandson, became an example of how even sophisticated, experienced individuals can be deceived when they want to believe in a compelling vision. The patients who received inaccurate test results, some showing false positives for HIV or incorrect pregnancy hormone levels that caused unnecessary anxiety and medical interventions, were perhaps the most tragic victims, as they had trusted Theranos with their health based on the company's promises of revolutionary technology. The regulatory failures that allowed Theranos to operate for years with inadequate oversight have prompted reforms in how laboratory testing is regulated, particularly for new laboratory-developed tests that had previously operated in a regulatory gray area. Elizabeth Holmes, once celebrated as a visionary and role model for young women in technology, now serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing narrative and fundraising over scientific validity, about the ethical responsibility that comes with making healthcare claims, and about how fraud can be dressed up as innovation when accountability mechanisms fail. Her imprisonment represents one of the rare instances where a prominent Silicon Valley founder faced serious criminal consequences for defrauding investors, a precedent that may influence how entrepreneurs balance ambition with honesty in the future. As she serves her sentence, now in her late 30s with 2 young children, Holmes has become emblematic of how the pursuit of success and the desire to change the world can, without ethical guardrails and truthfulness, transform into criminal conduct that harms the very people it claimed to help, and her case continues to generate discussion about gender, power, and accountability in the technology industry and beyond. Number 3. The LIBOR manipulation scandal. Rigging the world's most important number. The London Interbank Offered Rate, known as LIBOR, served as the benchmark interest rate that underpinned hundreds of trillions of dollars in financial contracts worldwide, from mortgages and student loans to complex derivative instruments, making it arguably the most important number in global finance, and for years, traders at some of the world's largest and most respected banks conspired to manipulate this rate for profit in a fraud that struck at the heart of the financial system's integrity. LIBOR represented the average interest rate at which major banks reported they could borrow from each other in the London interbank market, and it was calculated daily for multiple currencies and borrowing periods by collecting submissions from a panel of banks and taking an average after trimming the highest and lowest quartiles. The rate was supposed to reflect the actual borrowing costs banks faced, serving as an honest barometer of credit conditions. But the system relied on banks' self-reporting and was overseen by a private trade association rather than a government regulator, creating vulnerabilities that certain traders recognized and exploited. The manipulation occurred through two primary mechanisms. First, traders would request that their own bank's LIBOR submitters report artificially high or low rates depending on the trader's positions in derivative contracts tied to LIBOR, allowing them to profit from even tiny movements in the benchmark. And second, during the financial crisis, banks including Barclays would submit artificially low rates to hide their true borrowing costs and appear more financially healthy than they were, since high LIBOR submissions would signal that a bank was considered a credit risk by the market. The scheme involved traders at multiple international banks including Barclays, UBS, Royal Bank of Scotland, Deutsche Bank, Rabobank, and others, and it persisted for years because the individuals involved viewed LIBOR submissions as malleable numbers that could be adjusted for trading advantage rather than as critical financial data that needed to be accurate and honest. Internal communications recovered during investigations revealed the casual, almost brazen nature of the manipulation, with traders sending messages like, "Dude, I owe you big time. Come over one day after work and I'm opening a bottle of Bollinger," after a submitter had adjusted rates to benefit the trader's positions, or "If you know how to keep a secret, I'll bring you in on it," when discussing LIBOR manipulation schemes. At UBS, traders on different continents coordinated their requests to rate submitters, sometimes offering payments or small bribes in the form of meals or maintaining relationships that would ensure cooperation. At Barclays, evidence showed that manipulation occurred from at least 2005 through 2009, with dozens of documented requests from traders to rate submitters to adjust the bank's LIBOR submissions, and there were also instances where Barclays executives directed lower submissions during the 2008 financial crisis after receiving signals from British government officials that their high LIBOR rates were drawing unwanted attention. The scale of potential harm from this manipulation was enormous because LIBOR affected so many financial instruments. When rates were manipulated even by a few basis points, it could cost or benefit counterparties millions of dollars in individual trades, and when multiplied across the global financial system, the theoretical damages ran into the billions, though calculating precise harm to specific parties proved extremely difficult because markets are complex and proving that any particular transaction outcome resulted from manipulation rather than legitimate market forces was challenging. The unraveling of the LIBOR scandal began in 2008 when a Wall Street Journal article questioned whether banks were reporting their true borrowing costs. But serious regulatory action didn't commence until 2012 when Barclays reached a settlement with American and British authorities, agreeing to pay $450 million in fines and disgorgement. The Barclays settlement was a watershed moment because it included detailed findings about the manipulation and implicated not just rogue traders, but also bank management who had been aware of or participated in the misconduct. The revelations led to the resignation of Barclays CEO Bob Diamond and triggered investigations into other banks and prosecutions of individual traders and submitters. UBS reached an even larger settlement in December 2012, paying $1.5 billion to American, British, and Swiss authorities, and its Japanese subsidiary pleaded guilty to one count of wire fraud, marking one of the rare instances where a major financial institution admitted criminal wrongdoing rather than settling without acknowledging guilt. The UBS settlement revealed that more than 40 individuals had been involved in the manipulation over a 6-year period, and it provided immunity to the bank in exchange for cooperation, though individual traders faced prosecution. Royal Bank of Scotland paid $612 million in 2013, and its Japanese subsidiary also pleaded guilty to wire fraud. Other banks followed with substantial settlements, including Deutsche Bank, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, and brokerages that had facilitated communications between traders. The total fines and settlements across all institutions exceeded $9 billion by the time enforcement actions concluded. Individual prosecutions proved more challenging than institutional settlements, as prosecutors had to prove that specific traders had committed criminal fraud rather than engaged in conduct that was widespread and that they might have believed was acceptable within the culture of their trading floors. In Britain, Tom Hayes, a former UBS and Citigroup trader, became the first individual prosecuted for LIBOR manipulation when he was arrested in 2012. Hayes, who was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome and whose defense argued this condition affected his understanding of social norms and rules, was convicted in 2015 of conspiracy to defraud and sentenced to 14 years in prison. later reduced to 11 years on appeal. Hayes had been remarkably successful as a trader, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in profit for his employers, but evidence at trial showed he had orchestrated an extensive network of brokers and rate submitters across multiple institutions to manipulate rates in his favor, treating LIBOR manipulation as a routine part of his trading strategy. He maintained throughout his trial and imprisonment that his conduct had been known and tacitly approved by his superiors, and that he was being made a scapegoat for industry-wide practices, claims that gained some credibility when recordings emerged of senior bank officials discussing rate submissions. Other British traders were also convicted, including 6 former brokers who facilitated Hayes's manipulation, though their sentences were lighter. In the United States, prosecutions were less successful, with several traders and submitters being acquitted by juries who appeared skeptical that the conduct rose to the level of criminal fraud or that the defendants had specific intent to defraud when operating in an environment where such behavior seemed normalized. The Department of Justice secured some convictions, including against 2 former Rabobank traders who were sentenced to prison time, but several high-profile prosecutions ended in acquittal or hung juries. The LIBOR scandal prompted fundamental reforms to how benchmark interest rates are calculated and governed. In 2014, administration of LIBOR was transferred from the British Bankers Association to the Intercontinental Exchange, a regulated exchange operator, and rules were strengthened to require that submissions be based on actual transactions rather than estimates of borrowing costs. More significantly, regulators announced that LIBOR would be phased out entirely by the end of 2021 and replaced with alternative reference rates based on actual transaction data rather than bank estimates, such as the secured overnight financing rate in the United States. The transition away from LIBOR, which had been in use since the 1980s, represented an enormous undertaking given the hundreds of trillions of dollars in contracts that referenced the rate, and the phase-out was extended to mid-2023 for certain currencies to allow more time for the transition. The scandal also led to increased scrutiny of other financial benchmarks and to broader questions about the culture of major banks where profit maximization appeared to trump ethical conduct and where traders operated with insufficient supervision or regard for the integrity of the financial system. Critics pointed out that despite the enormous fines, no senior executives at any of the banks involved faced criminal prosecution, reinforcing perceptions that the financial system operates with different standards for senior managers than for lower-level employees. Tom Hayes was released from prison in 2021 after serving about half his sentence, and he has continued to argue that he was unfairly singled out for prosecution while those who supervised and benefited from his activities faced only financial penalties that were ultimately paid by shareholders rather than the individuals responsible. The LIBOR manipulation scandal remains one of the clearest examples of how fraud can become institutionalized within major financial institutions when competitive pressures, inadequate controls, and a culture of rule-bending converge, and it demonstrated that even rates that seem to be objective reflections of market conditions can be manipulated when they rely on self-reporting and lack robust independent verification. The affair undermined public confidence in the integrity of financial markets and in the idea that rates and prices discovered in those markets represent genuine supply and demand rather than potential manipulation by powerful insiders, and it reinforced the need for strong regulatory oversight, objective data sources, and cultural change within institutions that have enormous power over the global economy. For borrowers whose mortgages, student loans, and other financial obligations were tied to LIBOR during the period of manipulation, there remains frustration that they may have paid artificially high rates or received artificially low investment returns without any practical recourse or compensation, as proving individual harm from the manipulation has been prohibitively difficult despite the clear evidence that rates were rigged. The legacy of the LIBOR scandal continues to influence financial regulation and market structure as authorities work to create benchmark rates that are more resistant to manipulation and to establish clearer accountability for both institutions and individuals when fraud occurs at the intersection of complex financial markets and criminal conduct. Number 4. The Enron scandal. When America's most innovative company was built on lies, Enron Corporation began as a modest natural gas pipeline company formed from the 1985 merger of Houston Natural Gas and InterNorth. But under the leadership of CEO Kenneth Lay and later President Jeffrey Skilling, it transformed into what appeared to be one of America's most dynamic and innovative companies, claiming revenues of over $100 billion and being named by Fortune magazine as America's most innovative company for 6 consecutive years from 1996 to 2001. Even as its success was built on an elaborate architecture of accounting fraud, special purpose entities, and systematic deception that would ultimately become the largest bankruptcy in American history at that time and lead to criminal convictions that sent executives to prison while destroying the retirement savings of thousands of employees. The fraud at Enron was sophisticated in its use of accounting rules and corporate structures to hide debt and inflate profits, creating an illusion of success that kept stock prices high while insiders sold shares and the company spiraled toward collapse. Enron's business model evolved during the 1990s from traditional energy delivery to energy trading and risk management, positioning itself as a market maker that would revolutionize energy markets through deregulation and financial innovation. And the company expanded into areas like broadband communications and water services, always promising investors that new ventures would generate enormous future profits. The key to maintaining the appearance of success was mark-to-market accounting, a method that allowed Enron to book projected future profits from long-term contracts immediately rather than recognizing revenue as it was actually earned over time, which meant that optimistic projections about the value of deals could be recorded as current income even if the actual cash flows wouldn't materialize for years or might never materialize at all. When deals failed to generate projected profits or when losses occurred, rather than reporting these accurately, Enron executives created hundreds of special purpose entities, or SPEs, which were technically separate companies but were often controlled by Enron executives, most notably Chief Financial Officer Andrew Fastow, who used these entities to hide debt off Enron's balance sheet and to create artificial profits through transactions between Enron and the SPEs. Fastow personally profited by tens of millions of dollars from managing these entities, creating obvious conflicts of interest that should have raised alarms but were approved by Enron's board of directors, who waived the company's ethics policies to allow Fastow's involvement. The SPEs had names like LJM Cayman, Chuco, and Raptor, and they served various fraudulent purposes including purchasing poorly performing assets from Enron at inflated prices to prevent losses from appearing on Enron's books, entering into derivative contracts that created artificial hedges allowing Enron to avoid recognizing losses, and taking on debt that would otherwise have damaged Enron's credit rating and balance sheet ratios. The structures were so complex that even sophisticated analysts had difficulty understanding them, which was partly by design, as opacity served to prevent scrutiny of transactions that wouldn't withstand close examination. Enron's executives promoted a corporate culture of arrogance and aggression, with Jeffrey Skilling implementing a performance review system nicknamed Rank and Yank that forced managers to rank employees and fire the bottom 15% annually, creating intense pressure to meet targets and discouraging anyone from questioning dubious practices. The company's success made its executives wealthy and celebrated, with Skilling, Fastow, and others selling millions of dollars worth of stock while publicly expressing confidence in the company's future and encouraging employees to keep their retirement savings invested in Enron shares. The company's board included prominent figures and was advised by prestigious law firms and audited by Arthur Andersen, one of the Big Five accounting firms, which both audited Enron's books and provided lucrative consulting services, creating conflicts of interest that compromised the independence of the audit function. Warning signs emerged throughout 2001 as Bethany McLean, a reporter for Fortune magazine, published an article in March titled "Is Enron Overpriced?", questioning how Enron actually made money and why its financial statements were so opaque, and short seller James Chanos began betting against Enron stock after analyzing the company's disclosures and concluding that the cash flow didn't support the reported earnings. Enron executive Sharon Watkins sent an anonymous memo to Kenneth Lay in August 2001 warning that the company would implode in a wave of accounting scandals, and detailing her concerns about the accounting treatments being used. But Lay consulted with lawyers who advised that while there were issues to address, there was no need for immediate action, and Watkins's concerns were not adequately investigated or acted upon. On October 16, 2001, Enron announced its first quarterly loss in over 4 years and disclosed a $1.2 billion reduction in shareholder equity related to unwinding certain SPE transactions, and this announcement triggered intense scrutiny from analysts and the Securities and Exchange Commission. As questions mounted, Enron's stock price began to collapse, falling from over $90 per share in mid-2000 to around $15 by late October 2001, and the decline accelerated as more information emerged about the extent of the company's financial problems and the conflicts of interest involving Fastow and the SPEs. On October 24, 2001, Enron announced that Fastow was being replaced as CFO, though the company claimed this was to restore investor confidence rather than an admission of wrongdoing. Credit rating agencies, which had maintained investment-grade ratings on Enron despite the warning signs, finally downgraded the company's debt to junk status in late November, which triggered provisions in Enron's complex financing arrangements requiring immediate repayment of billions of dollars in obligations that the company could not meet. Dynegy, another energy company, had agreed to acquire Enron for approximately $9 billion, but pulled out of the deal on November 28 after discovering the extent of Enron's hidden debts and financial problems. On December 2, 2001, Enron filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection with $63 billion in assets, making it the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history at that time, and approximately 4,000 employees were laid off immediately, many losing not just their jobs but their retirement savings, which had been heavily invested in now worthless Enron stock. The collapse of Enron triggered multiple investigations and prosecutions, with the Department of Justice creating an Enron task force to pursue criminal charges against those responsible for the fraud. Arthur Andersen, Enron's auditor, was indicted for obstruction of justice after employees shredded thousands of documents related to the Enron audit following the start of the SEC investigation. And in June 2002, a jury convicted the firm, effectively destroying one of the world's largest accounting firms and putting approximately 28,000 American employees out of work, though the conviction was later overturned by the Supreme Court on the grounds that the jury instructions were flawed, a reversal that came too late to save the firm. The criminal prosecutions of Enron executives became some of the most high-profile white-collar cases in American history. Andrew Fastow, facing 98 counts of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy, ultimately pleaded guilty to 2 counts of conspiracy in 2004 and agreed to forfeit $30 million and cooperate with prosecutors against other executives in exchange for a 10-year prison sentence, of which he served 6 years before being released to a halfway house in 2011. His wife, Leah Fastow, who had served as assistant treasurer at Enron and participated in some of the fraudulent transactions, pleaded guilty to tax crimes and served 1 year in prison. Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling were indicted together in 2004 on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy, and their trial, which began in January 2006, became a media spectacle and a test of whether prosecutors could hold top executives accountable for corporate fraud even when they claimed ignorance of the specific accounting manipulations. The prosecution presented evidence that Lay and Skilling knew Enron's success was illusory and that they had made false statements to investors, employees, and analysts while selling their own stock, and testimony from cooperating witnesses including Fastow detailed how the fraudulent schemes operated and how senior management was aware of them. The defense argued that Lay and Skilling had believed Enron was a fundamentally sound company that had been destroyed by a crisis of confidence and bad publicity rather than by fraud, and that complex accounting decisions had been reviewed by lawyers and accountants who had approved them. On May 25, 2006, after more than 5 days of deliberation, the jury convicted Skilling on 19 of 28 counts including fraud, conspiracy, and insider trading, and convicted Lay on all 6 counts of fraud and conspiracy in the criminal trial, as well as in a separate bench trial on 4 counts of bank fraud related to personal loans. Judge Sim Lake scheduled sentencing for September 2006, and Skilling faced the possibility of decades in prison, but before sentencing could occur, Kenneth Lay died of a heart attack on July 5, 2006, while vacationing in Colorado. Because Lay died before exhausting his appeals, his conviction was vacated, meaning legally he died without having been convicted, an outcome that frustrated prosecutors and victims who felt he had escaped justice. Jeffrey Skilling was sentenced in October 2006 to 24 years and 4 months in federal prison and was ordered to pay $45 million in restitution, one of the harshest sentences ever imposed in a white-collar case at that time, with Judge Lake stating that Skilling's crimes had imposed a wave of terror on Enron employees and shareholders. Skilling appealed his conviction and sentence, and in 2013, after serving 12 years, he reached an agreement with prosecutors to reduce his sentence to 14 years in exchange for dropping his appeals and not opposing the distribution of $40 million of his seized assets to fraud victims. He was released from federal custody in February 2019 after serving approximately 12.5 years. Other Enron executives also faced prosecution, including Chief Accounting Officer Richard Causey, who pleaded guilty to securities fraud and served 5.5 years in prison, and former Treasurer Ben Glisson Jr., who pleaded guilty to conspiracy and served 5 years. Over a dozen individuals connected to Enron were ultimately convicted or pleaded guilty to crimes related to the fraud. The broader impact of the Enron scandal extended far beyond the individual prosecutions and included significant legislative and regulatory reforms. Congress passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in July 2002, which imposed new requirements on corporate governance, financial reporting, and auditor independence, including requiring CEOs and CFOs to personally certify the accuracy of financial statements and creating criminal penalties for certification of false statements, establishing the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board to regulate auditors, and requiring companies to have independent audit committees. The law represented the most significant change to securities laws since the 1930s and was a direct response to Enron and other accounting scandals like WorldCom that emerged around the same time. The accounting industry was forced to separate consulting services from audit functions to reduce conflicts of interest, and the Big Five accounting firms became the Big Four after Arthur Andersen's collapse. For the thousands of former Enron employees who lost their jobs and retirement savings, there was limited compensation despite years of litigation, as bankruptcy proceedings distributed available assets to creditors according to priority, and most equity holders received nothing while unsecured creditors received only a fraction of what they were owed. A settlement fund of $7.2 billion was eventually created through litigation against Enron's banks and other third parties accused of facilitating the fraud, with major banks including Citigroup, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce paying substantial settlements for their roles in helping Enron structure deceptive transactions, and this fund provided some recovery to investors, though far less than their losses. The Enron case became a touchstone for discussions of corporate fraud, ethics, and governance, illustrating how a culture that prioritizes short-term stock price over sustainable business practices can lead to disaster, how conflicts of interest among auditors, lawyers, and directors can compromise oversight, and how complex financial structures can be used to obscure rather than illuminate a company's true financial condition. It demonstrated that fraud can occur even at companies with prestigious reputations, sophisticated advisors, and experienced boards when incentives are misaligned and accountability mechanisms fail. The energy industry and financial markets were permanently changed by Enron's collapse, with increased skepticism toward companies that couldn't clearly explain how they made money and greater regulatory scrutiny of off-balance sheet entities and mark-to-market accounting. Jeffrey Skilling, after his release from prison, maintained in interviews that he had not committed crimes and that Enron had been a good company destroyed by external forces, showing little contrition for the harm caused to employees and investors. While Andrew Fastow has spoken publicly about his crimes and the rationalizations he used to justify unethical conduct, offering a cautionary tale about how incrementally crossing ethical lines can lead to serious criminality. The Enron scandal remains relevant more than 2 decades later as a reminder that corporate fraud on a massive scale is possible even with supposedly robust oversight systems in place, and that holding individuals accountable requires not just regulatory mechanisms but also prosecutors willing to pursue complex cases and juries willing to convict executives who claim they didn't understand the implications of their actions. And it continues to influence how companies structure their financial reporting, how auditors approach their responsibilities, and how investors evaluate the credibility of corporate claims about innovation and future profitability. Number 5. The Volkswagen emissions scandal, Dieselgate, and the engineering of deception. Volkswagen Group, one of the world's largest and most respected automobile manufacturers with a reputation built on German engineering excellence, became embroiled in one of the most brazen and technically sophisticated frauds in corporate history when it was revealed in September 2015 that the company had deliberately programmed millions of diesel vehicles to cheat on emissions tests by detecting when the vehicles were being tested and temporarily reducing pollution output to meet legal standards, while during normal driving conditions the vehicles emitted nitrogen oxides at levels up to 40 times the legal limit in the United States. A scheme that involved engineers, managers, and executives at the highest levels of the company, and that persisted for nearly a decade before being uncovered by researchers and regulators. The fraud, which came to be known as Dieselgate, affected approximately 11 million vehicles worldwide across multiple brands including Volkswagen, Audi, Porsche, and Skoda, and it represented not just a regulatory violation but a deliberate decision to prioritize sales and market share over environmental protection and public health, with the company actively deceiving regulators and consumers while marketing its diesel vehicles as clean diesel that combined performance with Environmental responsibility. Volkswagen had invested heavily in diesel technology as part of its strategy to compete in the American market, where diesel passenger vehicles had historically been less popular than in Europe, and the company saw an opportunity to differentiate itself by offering diesel models that supposedly met strict American emission standards without sacrificing the fuel efficiency and performance that diesel engines could provide. The challenge was that meeting these emission standards, particularly for nitrogen oxides or NOx, which contribute to smog and respiratory problems, required expensive after-treatment systems that could reduce performance and fuel economy or require frequent maintenance involving urea-based additives. Rather than solve this engineering problem legitimately through better technology or accept the performance trade-offs necessary to meet standards cleanly, engineers at Volkswagen developed what they called a defeat device, software that could recognize when a vehicle was undergoing emissions testing based on factors like the vehicle's speed, engine operation, air pressure, and steering wheel position, and when testing conditions were detected, the software would adjust the engine management system to prioritize emissions reduction, but during normal driving the software would prioritize performance and fuel economy while allowing NOx emissions to exceed legal limits by factors of 10, 20, or even 40 times. This defeat device was integrated into the engine control unit software of millions of vehicles equipped with Volkswagen's EA189 diesel engine and later the EA288 engine, and it represented a calculated fraud that had to be approved at multiple levels of the organization and required ongoing deception to maintain as regulators asked questions and as the software was updated in new model years. The scheme began to unravel not through regulatory oversight but through independent research when the International Council on Clean Transportation, a nonprofit research organization, commissioned West Virginia University to conduct real-world emissions testing of diesel vehicles as part of a study intended to demonstrate that modern diesel technology could meet strict standards. Researchers Ervin Thairvangadam, Mark Besch, and Daniel Carter equipped several vehicles with portable emissions measurement systems and tested them under normal driving conditions on roads in California in 2014, and they discovered that two Volkswagen models, a Jetta and a Passat, showed dramatically different emissions profiles when tested on the road compared to their laboratory test results, with NOx emissions far exceeding legal limits during normal driving. The researchers initially suspected their equipment or methodology was flawed, but after repeating tests and checking their systems, they concluded the disparity was real and reported their findings to the California Air Resources Board and to the Environmental Protection Agency. When confronted with this data in 2014, Volkswagen initially denied any wrongdoing and suggested that the elevated emissions might be due to technical issues that could be addressed through a software update, and the company issued a voluntary recall of about 500,000 vehicles supposedly to fix the problem, but subsequent testing by regulators showed that the fix did not adequately address the emissions issues. The EPA continued investigating with help from CARB, and through detailed analysis of the engine control software and testing under various conditions, regulators concluded that the elevated emissions were not accidental, but resulted from intentional programming, and the EPA confronted Volkswagen with evidence of the defeat device in July 2015. On September 3, 2015, Volkswagen admitted to the EPA and CARB that it had installed defeat device software in its diesel vehicles. And on September 18, 2015, the EPA issued a notice of violation to Volkswagen Group of America, revealing publicly that approximately 480,000 vehicles in the United States contained software designed to cheat emissions tests, an announcement that shocked the automotive industry and the public and sent Volkswagen's stock price plummeting. Within days, Volkswagen's investigation expanded the scandal to include 11 million vehicles globally, and CEO Martin Winterkorn resigned on September 23, 2015, stating that he was shocked by the events but accepting responsibility as the company's leader, though he denied personal knowledge of the defeat device. The company's initial response emphasized that the wrongdoing was the work of a few engineers acting without authorization, but investigations would reveal that the fraud was far more widespread and systematic. Criminal investigations were launched in multiple countries, with the U.S. Department of Justice, German prosecutors, and authorities in other jurisdictions seeking to determine who authorized the defeat device, when executives learned of it, and whether the fraud extended to other forms of misconduct. The U.S. investigation uncovered evidence that Volkswagen employees had deliberately concealed the defeat device, destroyed documents, and lied to regulators even after the EPA began asking pointed questions about emissions discrepancies. On January 11, 2017, Volkswagen pleaded guilty in a U.S. federal court to 3 criminal felony counts, including conspiracy to defraud the United States, to commit wire fraud, and to violate the Clean Air Act, marking one of the few times a major corporation pleaded guilty to criminal charges rather than negotiating a deferred prosecution agreement. As part of the plea agreement, Volkswagen agreed to pay a $4.3 billion criminal penalty in addition to civil settlements that included $14.7 billion to compensate American vehicle owners, states, and dealers, and to fund environmental remediation. The total cost to Volkswagen of settlements, recalls, retrofits, and legal fees has exceeded $30 billion globally, making it one of the most expensive corporate scandals in history. Individual prosecutions followed as U.S. authorities sought to hold specific executives and engineers accountable. Oliver Schmidt, a Volkswagen executive who had served as the company's liaison with U.S. regulators and who participated in meetings where the company decided to continue hiding the defeat device rather than disclose it, was arrested in January 2017 when he flew to Miami for vacation, apparently not realizing he faced criminal charges. Schmidt pleaded guilty to conspiracy to defraud the United States in violation of the Clean Air Act and was sentenced in December 2017 to 7 years in federal prison and a $400,000 fine, with Judge Sean Cox stating that Schmidt and his colleagues had decided to lie to regulators and that the crime was motivated by plain, old-fashioned greed. James Leong, an engineer who had worked on the development of the defeat device software, pleaded guilty to conspiracy in 2016 and cooperated with prosecutors, providing testimony about how the fraud operated and who was involved, and he was sentenced to 40 months in prison and 2 years of supervised release. Giovanni Pamio, another engineer involved in developing the defeat device, pleaded guilty to conspiracy and wire fraud in 2016 and received a 3-year prison sentence. Several other Volkswagen executives and employees were indicted by U.S. prosecutors but remained in Germany, which does not extradite its citizens, including Heinz-Jakob Neusser, Jens Hadeler, Richard Dorenkamp, Bernd Gottweiss, and Jürgen Peter, who were charged with conspiracy and fraud but have not faced trial because they have not traveled to the United States since being indicted. Most significantly, U.S. prosecutors indicted Martin Winterkorn, the former CEO, in 2018 on charges of conspiracy and wire fraud, alleging that Winterkorn was informed about the defeat device in 2014 but authorized the company to continue its cover-up rather than disclose the fraud to regulators, charges that Winterkorn has denied, and he has remained in Germany beyond the reach of American prosecution. German prosecutors have also pursued their own investigation of Winterkorn and other executives, and in April 2019, German authorities charged Winterkorn with serious fraud in connection with Dieselgate, alleging he knew about the defeat device no later than May 2014, but failed to inform authorities and allowed affected vehicles to continue being sold. The trial faced numerous delays due to Winterkorn's health issues and the complexity of the case. And as of 2024, proceedings were continuing in German courts. In civil litigation, Volkswagen faced class action lawsuits from vehicle owners, investors, and others harmed by the fraud, and the company has paid out billions in settlements, including agreeing to buy back or retrofit affected vehicles for U.S. owners and to compensate them for the lost value and inconvenience. The scandal also raised questions about regulatory oversight in both the United States and Europe, as the defeat device had gone undetected for years despite emissions testing requirements, and it emerged that European testing standards were particularly lenient and that manufacturers had been allowed to conduct tests under optimal conditions that didn't reflect real-world driving, allowing many vehicles to pass laboratory tests while polluting heavily on actual roads. The scandal prompted reforms to emissions testing, including the introduction of real-world driving emissions tests in Europe and increased scrutiny of engine control software. The health and environmental impact of the excess emissions from Volkswagen diesel vehicles has been estimated by researchers to include significant contributions to air pollution, with one study published in the journal Environmental Research Letters estimating that the excess emissions in Europe alone could contribute to approximately 1,200 premature deaths, though such estimates involve assumptions about exposure and health effects that are debated. Beyond the legal and financial consequences, the scandal damaged Volkswagen's reputation and brand value, particularly in the United States where the company had invested heavily in rebuilding its image through its clean diesel marketing campaign and trust in diesel technology more broadly was undermined, contributing to a shift away from diesel vehicles in many markets. The scandal also affected the broader automotive industry as regulators began investigating other manufacturers for potential emissions cheating, and several companies including Fiat Chrysler, Mercedes-Benz, and Porsche faced allegations or settlements related to emissions violations, though none involved fraud as systematic and deliberate as Volkswagen's defeat device. Within Volkswagen, the scandal led to significant management changes, with new CEO Matthias Mahler, who was later replaced by Herbert Diess, promising cultural reform and a shift toward electric vehicles, and the company announced plans to invest tens of billions of dollars in electric vehicle development in an attempt to rehabilitate its image as an environmentally responsible manufacturer. The Dieselgate scandal stands as a stark example of how corporate fraud can involve not just financial manipulation but technical deception that directly harms public health and the environment, and how a culture that prioritizes meeting targets and maintaining competitiveness can lead to systematic criminal behavior when legitimate compliance seems too difficult or expensive. It demonstrated that even companies with strong technical capabilities and reputations for quality can engage in deliberate fraud when incentives are misaligned and ethical guardrails fail. And it showed that engineers and managers who might not think of themselves as criminals can become complicit in serious wrongdoing through a series of choices that prioritize corporate interests over legal obligations and public welfare. The prosecution of individuals like Oliver Schmidt and James Leong reinforced that corporate crimes have individual perpetrators who can be held accountable, though the fact that many senior executives including Winterkorn have not faced trial in the United States highlights the challenges of international prosecution and the limits of accountability when individuals remain in jurisdictions that protect them. The Volkswagen emissions scandal continues to have implications for how corporate environmental crimes are prosecuted, how emissions testing is conducted, how consumers view manufacturer claims about vehicle performance, and how regulators balance industry cooperation with enforcement. And it serves as a reminder that technological sophistication can be weaponized for fraud just as easily as it can be used for legitimate innovation, and that maintaining integrity in corporate decision-making requires not just rules and penalties but a culture that values honesty and compliance even when they conflict with short-term business objectives. Number 6. The college admissions scandal, Operation Varsity Blues, and the fraud of privilege. In March 2019, federal prosecutors announced charges against 50 people in what they described as the largest college admissions scandal ever prosecuted in the United States, revealing a scheme in which wealthy parents had paid millions of dollars in bribes to a college admissions consultant who used the money to facilitate cheating on standardized tests and to bribe coaches and university administrators to designate applicants as recruited athletes regardless of their actual athletic ability, thereby securing admission to elite universities including Yale, Stanford, Georgetown, the University of Southern California, and others for students who likely would not have been admitted through legitimate means. The mastermind of the scheme, William Rick Singer, operated through his for-profit college counseling business called The Key and his non-profit foundation Key Worldwide Foundation, which he used to disguise bribes as charitable donations that were tax-deductible for the parents who made them, creating a fraud that corrupted the college admissions process, defrauded universities, and gave wealthy families an illegal advantage while disadvantaged students competed fairly for limited spots at prestigious institutions. Singer, who had previously worked as a legitimate college admissions counselor, developed what he called a side door into elite universities that was distinct from the front door of legitimate admission through merit and the back door of large institutional donations, and his side door involved two primary schemes. First, facilitating cheating on the SAT and ACT exams by arranging for students to take tests at locations where Singer had bribed proctors to allow a ringer to take the test for the student or to correct answers after the student had completed it, and second, bribing college coaches and athletic administrators to designate applicants as recruited athletes in sports like rowing, water polo, soccer, tennis, and sailing, often involving fabricated athletic profiles complete with stock photos or digitally altered images of the students purporting to show them participating in sports they had never seriously played. The test cheating scheme was enabled by Mark Riddell, a Harvard graduate who worked as a test preparer and who had the ability to score nearly perfectly on standardized tests, and who would either take exams in place of students after they obtained extended time accommodations that allowed them to test at separate locations away from supervision, or would correct students' answers after they had completed exams under the supervision of corrupt proctors including Igor Dvorsky in Los Angeles. Singer paid Riddell $10,000 per test, and he charged parents far more, typically $75,000 per exam, pocketing the difference while ensuring that students received scores high enough to support their applications to elite schools. The recruited athlete scheme involved bribing coaches at various universities to designate applicants as athletic recruits, which gave them substantial advantages in the admissions process because recruited athletes often receive special consideration and face lower academic standards than other applicants. Singer paid coaches hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes, often funneling the money through his nonprofit foundation or through payments disguised as speaking fees or consulting arrangements, and in exchange coaches would request that admissions offices accept certain students as recruited members of their teams. Because actual athletic ability wasn't required, Singer and the parents would create fictional athletic profiles for students, sometimes using stock photographs of athletes or photoshopping the students' faces onto bodies of actual athletes, and inventing accomplishments and statistics that had no basis in reality. In one case, Lori Loughlin, an actress best known for her role on the television show Full House, and her husband Massimo Giannulli, a fashion designer, paid $500,000 in bribes to have their two daughters designated as recruits for the University of Southern California crew team despite neither daughter having ever participated in crew, and photos of the daughters posing on rowing machines were created to support the fraudulent applications. In another case, actress Felicity Huffman paid $15,000 to Singer to have Riddell correct her daughter's SAT answers at a test center where a corrupt proctor provided access. Other parents included prominent business executives, lawyers, and wealthy individuals from around the country, and amounts paid to Singer ranged from tens of thousands to millions of dollars depending on the services provided. The scheme was uncovered not through routine oversight of college admissions, but through an FBI investigation into an unrelated securities fraud case, in which investigators recorded a conversation that mentioned Singer's business, and this led to a broader investigation dubbed Operation Varsity Blues, in which FBI agents wiretapped Singer's phones and eventually convinced him to cooperate in 2018 by recording conversations with parents and coaches in which they discussed the scheme. On March 12, 2019, federal prosecutors unsealed indictments charging 50 people, including 33 parents, with conspiracy to commit mail fraud and honest services fraud, and in some cases wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit money laundering, and also charging coaches, test administrators, and others who facilitated the fraud. The charges alleged that the scheme had generated $25 million in bribes over nearly a decade, and that it had operated across multiple states and involved numerous universities, though the universities themselves were described as victims rather than participants in the fraud. The public reaction was intense and focused partly on the wealth and celebrity of some defendants, with Loughlin and Huffman becoming symbols of how the wealthy attempt to use money to circumvent systems that are supposed to reward merit. And the scandal sparked broader debates about inequality in college admissions, the advantages already available to wealthy families through legacy preferences and legal large donations, and the pressure on students and parents in an increasingly competitive admissions environment. Singer pleaded guilty in March 2019 to racketeering conspiracy, money laundering conspiracy, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and obstruction of justice, and he agreed to cooperate with prosecutors against the other defendants. He admitted in court that he had created a side door to elite universities and that his business was a scheme to defraud universities and students, and he acknowledged bribing coaches and facilitating cheating on standardized tests. Most of the defendants eventually pleaded guilty, though some fought the charges and took their cases to trial. Felicity Huffman was among the first parents to plead guilty, and in September 2019, she was sentenced to 14 days in prison, a $50,000 fine, 250 hours of community service, and 1 year of supervised release, a relatively lenient sentence that Judge Indira Talwani explained was appropriate given Huffman's acceptance of responsibility, her limited role in the scheme compared to others, and the fact that her daughter had been unaware of the cheating. Huffman served her prison time at a minimum security facility in October 2019 and completed it without incident, later speaking publicly about her remorse and the shame she felt for her actions. Lori Loughlin and Massimo Giannulli initially pleaded not guilty and fought the charges for over a year, with their defense arguing that they believed the payments to Singer were legitimate donations rather than bribes and that they had not understood the nature of what Singer was doing. But in May 2020, facing the prospect of trial and potentially much harsher sentences, they changed their pleas to guilty. Judge Nathaniel Gorton sentenced Loughlin in August 2020 to 2 months in prison, a $150,000 fine, 2 years of supervised release, and 150 hours of community service, and sentenced Giannulli to 5 months in prison, a $250,000 fine, 2 years of supervised release, and 250 hours of community service. Laughlin served her sentence from October to December 2020 at a federal facility in Dublin, California, and Giannulli served his sentence from November 2020 to April 2021, though he was released to home confinement before completing the full term. Other parents received varying sentences based on their level of involvement, amounts paid, and their cooperation with prosecutors, with some receiving probation only and others receiving prison terms of several months. Among the longest sentences was that of Douglas Hodge, former CEO of investment firm PIMCO, who pleaded guilty to conspiracy and tax fraud for paying more than $800,000 in bribes to secure admission for 4 of his children and was sentenced to 9 months in prison, the harshest penalty for any parent in the case. Some parents contested the charges, and 2 of them, Gamal Abdelaziz, a former casino executive, and John Wilson, a private equity investor, went to trial in the fall of 2021 and were convicted by a jury on fraud and bribery charges, with Abdelaziz subsequently sentenced to 1 year in prison for paying $300,000 to have his daughter admitted to USC as a fake basketball recruit, and Wilson sentenced to 15 months for paying bribes totaling more than $1.2 million for his 3 children. The coaches and administrators who accepted bribes also faced prosecution, with particularly significant cases including John Vandemoer, the Stanford sailing coach who received $677,000 for Singer's Foundation in exchange for supporting applicants who didn't sail, and who received 1 day in prison, 2 years of supervised release, and a $10,000 fine. Rudolph Rudy Meredith, the Yale women's soccer coach who accepted $450,000 in bribes and who received no prison time in exchange for his early cooperation, and Jovan Vavic, the longtime water polo coach at USC who received more than $250,000 in bribes and was convicted at trial, receiving 6 months in prison. Laura Yankee, a former assistant soccer coach at USC, pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy and agreed to cooperate against other defendants. Igor Dvorsky, the test administrator in Los Angeles who allowed students to cheat, pleaded guilty to conspiracy and was sentenced to probation. Mark Riddell, the test taker, pleaded guilty to fraud and money laundering conspiracy and was sentenced to 4 months in prison followed by supervised release and community service. William Rick Singer, as the central figure who cooperated extensively, did not face sentencing until January 2023 after prosecutors had completed other cases, and he was sentenced to 3.5 years in federal prison, the longest term in the scandal, along with forfeiture of over $10 million, with prosecutors noting that while his cooperation had been valuable, his role in corrupting the admissions process and deceiving universities and students warranted substantial punishment. Judge Ria Zobel, who sentenced Singer, stated that he had caused dramatic harm to the education system and to the public in general. The universities affected by the scandal, including USC, Yale, Stanford, Georgetown, and others, responded by firing or disciplining coaches involved in the scheme, reviewing their athletic recruitment and admissions procedures, and in some cases rescinding admission or degrees of students who had benefited from the fraud, though this proved complicated when students claimed they were unaware of their parents' actions. USC, which had more implicated coaches than any other institution, conducted an internal review and implemented reforms including additional oversight of athletic admissions and restrictions on how coaches can interact with development offices regarding prospective donors. The scandal prompted broader discussions about systemic issues in college admissions, including the advantages that wealth provides even through legal means such as legacy preferences that favor children of alumni, the ability to pay for expensive test preparation and college counselors, and large institutional donations that can influence admissions decisions. And while Operation Varsity Blues addressed illegal corruption, critics argued that it highlighted how the system already favors the privileged through mechanisms that are legal but perhaps equally unfair. The scandal also raised questions about the intense pressure and anxiety surrounding college admissions, particularly for upper-middle-class families who view attendance at elite universities as essential for their children's future success and social status, creating an environment where some parents felt desperate enough to break the law. For students who applied to and were rejected from the universities where Singer's clients gained fraudulent admission, there was particular anger at having potentially lost spots to less qualified candidates whose families could afford to buy their way in. though calculating actual harm was difficult because admissions decisions involve many factors and it's impossible to know with certainty who would have been admitted in the absence of the fraud. The scandal also tarnished the reputation of standardized testing and raised concerns about the security of SAT and ACT exams, leading to increased scrutiny of accommodation processes and testing security, and contributing to a broader trend toward test-optional admissions at many universities. The Operation Varsity Blues case illustrated how fraud can pervade systems that are supposed to identify and reward merit, how individuals with resources and connections can manipulate institutions through bribery and deception, and how the pressure to succeed can lead otherwise successful people to commit serious crimes that betray their values and harm others. It demonstrated that white-collar fraud extends beyond financial crimes to include corruption of educational institutions and processes that have significant impacts on young people's lives and opportunities. The relatively modest prison sentences received by most parents, typically measured in weeks or months rather than years, sparked debate about whether wealthy defendants receive more lenient treatment than others who commit fraud, though prosecutors and judges argued that the sentences reflected appropriate punishment for first-time offenders who showed remorse, and noted that the public shame and professional consequences faced by defendants were themselves significant penalties. William Rick Singer's prosecution and conviction represented accountability for someone who built a business model around fraud and corruption, though his ability to operate for nearly a decade before being caught raised questions about why universities had not detected the patterns of fraudulent athletic recruitment earlier and whether more robust verification procedures could have prevented the scheme. The scandal's long-term impact includes increased skepticism about athletic recruitment in college admissions, greater awareness among the public about various forms of admissions corruption, and ongoing debates about how to make college admissions more equitable while balancing legitimate institutional interests like athletic programs, alumni relations, and fundraising, and it serves as a reminder that the college admissions system, like other competitive selection processes, is vulnerable to corruption when incentives are strong and oversight is inadequate, and that maintaining integrity requires not just rules and penalties but active monitoring and cultural commitment to fairness and merit-based selection. Number 7. The WorldCom accounting fraud. When telecommunications giant collapsed under false numbers, WorldCom Incorporated rose from obscurity in the 1980s to become one of the largest telecommunications companies in the world through an aggressive acquisition strategy that saw it purchase dozens of smaller companies and eventually merge with MCI Communications in 1998 for $37 billion, creating what was then the largest corporate merger in American history. But behind the impressive growth story and the company's claims of continued profitability was a massive accounting fraud that inflated earnings by approximately $11 billion through improper capitalization of ordinary operating expenses and the creation of false revenue entries, a scheme that ultimately led to the largest bankruptcy in United States history at that time in July 2002, when the company filed for Chapter 11 with $107 billion in assets, surpassing even the Enron bankruptcy that had occurred just months earlier. The fraud was orchestrated primarily by Chief Financial Officer Scott Sullivan and Controller David Myers under pressure from Chief Executive Officer Bernard Ebbers, a former milkman and motel operator who had built WorldCom through charisma and deal-making, but who demanded that the company continue reporting growth and profits even as the telecommunications industry entered a severe downturn following the dot-com bubble burst and overcapacity in fiber optic networks. WorldCom's business model had depended on continual growth through acquisitions that brought new revenues and allowed the company to realize synergies and economies of scale. But by 2000 and 2001, the acquisition opportunities had largely been exhausted after regulators blocked WorldCom's proposed $41 billion acquisition of Sprint on antitrust grounds, and the company faced the reality of operating in a mature, competitive market where its growth rates would necessarily slow and profit margins would compress. Rather than report these natural business realities and face the likelihood that the company's stock price would decline and Ebbers would personally face margin calls on loans he had taken out using his WorldCom stock as collateral, the company's leadership chose to manufacture profits through accounting manipulations that bore no relationship to actual business performance. The fraud took two primary forms. First, and most significantly, WorldCom began improperly capitalizing ordinary line costs, which were the fees the company paid to lease network capacity from other telecommunications providers, treating these routine operating expenses as capital expenditures that could be amortized over many years rather than expensed immediately. a change that had the effect of reducing reported expenses and inflating reported profits by billions of dollars. And second, the company created false revenue entries by releasing reserves that had been set aside for various contingencies and recognizing these releases as corporate unallocated revenue, even though no actual revenue had been earned. These manipulations were directed by Sullivan and Myers and were implemented through journal entries that were made in the company's accounting systems, often at the end of quarters when it became clear that actual results would fall short of expectations and Wall Street analyst forecasts. The scheme required the cooperation or acquiescence of multiple individuals in WorldCom's accounting and finance departments, and it was hidden from the company's external auditors at Arthur Andersen through a variety of means, including providing incomplete information, making adjustments at the corporate level that bypassed normal controls, and actively misleading auditors about the nature of certain entries. The fraud began in modest amounts in 1999, but escalated dramatically in 2000 and 2001 as the telecommunications industry deteriorated and the gap between WorldCom's actual performance and market expectations grew wider, with quarterly manipulations reaching hundreds of millions and eventually billions of dollars as the conspirators found themselves trapped in a cycle where each quarter's fraud created a larger hole that had to be filled with even greater manipulations in subsequent quarters. Bernard Ebers, while not an accountant himself and possibly not understanding all the technical details of the accounting manipulations, was fully aware that the company's reported results did not reflect actual performance, and he pressured Sullivan and others to hit the numbers and maintained an imperious management style that discouraged dissent and questioning of financial decisions. Ebers had also borrowed hundreds of millions of dollars from WorldCom's board-approved loan program, using his WorldCom stock as collateral, creating a personal financial incentive to keep the stock price elevated and making him potentially vulnerable to margin calls if the stock declined. The fraud began to unravel in March 2002 when the Securities and Exchange Commission launched an investigation into WorldCom's accounting practices after questions emerged about the company's financial reporting, and this prompted WorldCom's new internal audit chief Cynthia Cooper to conduct her own investigation into the company's books. Cooper, who had worked at WorldCom for years and knew many of the people involved, began reviewing capital expenditure accounts with her small team working late at night and in secret because they feared Sullivan and others might try to stop the investigation or destroy evidence if they learned about it. Cooper and her team discovered billions of dollars in improperly capitalized line costs that had no legitimate accounting basis, and when she brought these findings to Sullivan, he attempted to explain them away and told her to stop the investigation. But Cooper persisted and took her findings directly to the company's audit committee in June 2002. The audit committee launched an immediate investigation with outside lawyers and accountants, and on June 25, 2002, WorldCom announced that it had discovered accounting irregularities amounting to approximately $3.8 billion, a number that would later grow to $11 billion as the full extent of the fraud was revealed. The announcement caused WorldCom's already depressed stock to collapse further, wiped out virtually all remaining shareholder value, and triggered the company's bankruptcy filing on July 21, 2002. Scott Sullivan was fired immediately upon the discovery of the fraud, as was controller David Myers, and Bernard Ebers resigned as CEO in April 2002 amid questions about his personal loans from the company. Just before the accounting fraud was publicly revealed, though, he claimed his departure was unrelated to any accounting issues. The SEC filed civil fraud charges against WorldCom and several executives, and the Department of Justice launched a criminal investigation that would result in some of the most significant white-collar prosecutions of the era. David Myers pleaded guilty in September 2002 to securities fraud, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, and filing false statements, becoming the first WorldCom executive to cooperate with prosecutors, and he agreed to testify against others in exchange for a recommended sentence of 5 years, though he ultimately received 1 year and 1 day in prison after providing substantial assistance. Buford Yates, the director of general accounting, also pleaded guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges and agreed to cooperate. Scott Sullivan initially pleaded not guilty and appeared prepared to fight the charges, but in March 2004, he changed his plea to guilty on all charges including securities fraud, conspiracy, and false regulatory filings, acknowledging that he had orchestrated the accounting fraud and had known it was wrong, and agreeing to cooperate against Bernard Ebers in exchange for prosecutors recommending a reduced sentence, and Sullivan ultimately received 5 years in prison, significantly less than the maximum he faced, but more than some other cooperating witnesses because of his central role in designing and implementing the fraud. The prosecution of Bernard Ebers was the most high-profile and controversial of the WorldCom cases because, unlike Sullivan and the other accountants, Ebers claimed he had not known about the specific accounting manipulations and that he had relied on Sullivan and others to handle financial reporting properly, essentially arguing that, as CEO, he was not responsible for understanding the details of the company's accounting and that Sullivan had deceived him along with everyone else. Prosecutors charged Ebers with securities fraud, conspiracy, and false regulatory filings, and his trial began in January 2005 in federal court in Manhattan. The prosecution presented evidence, including testimony from Scott Sullivan, that Ebers had been aware of the accounting fraud and had pressured Sullivan to produce the numbers Ebers wanted regardless of actual business performance. Testimony from other executives about Ebers's management style and his insistence on meeting targets, and evidence of Ebers's personal financial conflicts, including his massive loans from the company that gave him motive to keep the stock price high. The defense argued that Ebers had been a visionary who built WorldCom into a telecommunications powerhouse, that he had trusted his CFO to handle accounting matters appropriately, and that Sullivan was lying to reduce his own sentence by falsely implicating Ebers. The jury deliberated for 8 days before convicting Ebers on all 9 counts on March 15, 2005, apparently believing Sullivan's testimony and finding that even if Ebers hadn't understood the technical accounting details, he had known the reported numbers were false and had encouraged the fraud. Judge Barbara Jones sentenced Ebers on July 13, 2005, to 25 years in federal prison, one of the longest sentences ever imposed for white-collar crime, stating that Ebers had been the leader of the conspiracy and that his actions had caused extraordinary harm to shareholders, employees, and the public trust. The sentence reflected the massive scale of the fraud and the number of victims, including WorldCom employees who lost jobs and retirement savings, investors who lost billions of dollars, and creditors who were not fully repaid in bankruptcy. Ebers, who was 63 at sentencing, appealed his conviction unsuccessfully and entered federal prison in September 2006 to begin serving his term. His defenders, including his family and some business associates, maintained that he was not a sophisticated fraudster but a businessman who had been caught up in events he didn't fully understand. But prosecutors and victims argued that as CEO he bore ultimate responsibility for the company's conduct and that his claims of ignorance were not credible given the scale and duration of the fraud. The WorldCom bankruptcy was one of the largest and most complex in American history, and it took years to resolve, with creditors receiving partial payment and shareholders receiving nothing after their equity was wiped out. The company emerged from bankruptcy in 2004 as MCI Incorporated, having shed debt and restructured operations, and it operated for several years before being acquired by Verizon Communications in 2006 for $8.4 billion, a fraction of WorldCom's peak market value of over $180 billion. The collapse of WorldCom, coming just months after Enron, contributed to a crisis of confidence in corporate America and in accounting practices, and it was one of the primary drivers of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act's passage as legislators and regulators sought to prevent future frauds through enhanced corporate governance requirements, stronger internal controls, and greater accountability for executives. Arthur Andersen, which had also audited WorldCom in addition to Enron, faced criticism for failing to detect the massive fraud despite conducting annual audits. And while the firm's conviction in the Enron case had already effectively destroyed it, the WorldCom scandal further damaged the reputation of the accounting profession and led to increased scrutiny of auditor independence and audit quality. Cynthia Cooper, the internal audit chief who uncovered the fraud, became a celebrated whistleblower and was named one of Time magazine's Persons of the Year in 2002 along with other corporate whistleblowers, and her actions were credited with demonstrating the importance of internal audit functions and the courage required to challenge senior management when fraud is suspected. The WorldCom case illustrated how fraud can occur even at massive, publicly traded companies with supposedly robust oversight mechanisms including boards of directors, external auditors, and regulatory filings, and it showed how pressure to meet Wall Street expectations can lead executives to cross ethical and legal lines when actual business performance falls short. The fraud also demonstrated how accounting rules, while seemingly technical and objective, can be manipulated by those who understand them and who are willing to prioritize short-term results over accurate reporting, and it highlighted the importance of skepticism and verification even when dealing with trusted colleagues and subordinates. Bernard Ebers served more than 13 years of his sentence before being released to a halfway house in December 2019 after a judge granted compassionate release due to his declining health, including a diagnosis of dementia, and he died in February 2020 at age 78, having spent his final years of freedom in poor health and largely forgotten except as a symbol of corporate fraud. Scott Sullivan was released from prison in 2009 after serving his 5-year sentence and has largely stayed out of public view, while David Myers and other cooperating witnesses also completed their prison terms and returned to private life. The WorldCom fraud remains one of the largest accounting frauds in history and serves as a case study in business schools and accounting programs about how fraud schemes operate, how they are detected, and the consequences they carry for individuals, companies, and the broader economy, and it continues to inform debates about executive accountability, the effectiveness of internal and external audit functions, the role of corporate culture in encouraging or preventing fraud, and the appropriate severity of punishment for white-collar criminals whose actions cause widespread harm even if accomplished through ledger entries rather than violence. Number 8. The Bernie Madoff feeder fund frauds. How complicit enablers expanded the Ponzi scheme while Bernard Madoff himself orchestrated the largest Ponzi scheme in history. His fraud was enabled and expanded by a network of feeder funds and investment advisors who directed billions of dollars from their own clients into Madoff's operation, either willfully ignoring red flags that should have been obvious to financial professionals or in some cases actively participating in the deception. By conducting inadequate due diligence and collecting substantial fees for funneling money to Madoff without providing the oversight and investigation they owed to their clients, and several of these enablers faced their own criminal prosecutions and civil penalties after Madoff's scheme collapsed in December 2008. The feeder fund operators benefited from Madoff's reputation and the consistent returns he claimed to generate, and they earned management fees and performance fees based on the assets they placed with Madoff, creating financial incentives to continue the relationship and not ask too many questions even when his investment strategy seemed opaque and his returns seemed improbably consistent. Some of the largest feeder funds included Fairfield Greenwich Group's Fairfield Century Fund, which had approximately $7.5 billion invested with Madoff, Tremont Group Holdings, which had $3.3 billion with Madoff through various funds, and King 8 Management, which had nearly $3 billion with Madoff, and these and other feeder funds collected hundreds of millions of dollars in fees while doing minimal actual investment management since they were simply passing client money to Madoff and receiving statements from him about performance. The due diligence conducted by these firms was often superficial or non-existent. They didn't verify that Madoff was actually executing the trades he claimed. They didn't question why his returns were so consistent and showed so little volatility compared to market indices. They didn't adequately investigate his custodial arrangements or understand that his brother's small accounting firm was handling the audit for a multi-billion-dollar investment operation. And they didn't question why Madoff refused to allow them or their clients to have direct access to independent verification of holdings. Among the most egregious cases of feeder fund fraud was that of J. Ezra Merkin, a prominent New York financier and philanthropist who operated several funds including Gabriel Capital and Ariel Fund that invested exclusively or heavily with Madoff while charging clients high fees that they believed were for Merkin's investment expertise and active management, when in reality Merkin was simply depositing their money with Madoff and providing minimal oversight. Merkin raised approximately $2.4 billion from investors including charities, universities, and wealthy individuals, and he collected tens of millions of dollars in management fees while presenting himself as a sophisticated money manager who was personally selecting securities and managing portfolios. After Madoff's arrest, Merkin faced civil lawsuits from the New York Attorney General and from defrauded investors, and in 2009, New York Attorney General Andrew Cuomo filed a civil fraud complaint accusing Merkin of betraying hundreds of investors including Yeshiva University, Mort Zuckerman, and various charitable foundations by concealing that he was actually just a conduit to Madoff while charging exorbitant fees for virtually no work. Merkin settled with the Attorney General in 2009 for $405 million, one of the largest settlements in New York history, though he did not admit wrongdoing, and he also reached settlements with various private litigants including paying Yeshiva University $45 million. The trustee liquidating Madoff's firm, Irving Picard, sued Merkin seeking to recover $675 million, and this case was eventually settled for $435 million. Merkin was forced to resign from the boards of various cultural and educational institutions including Yeshiva University, and while he avoided criminal prosecution, His reputation was destroyed, and he became a symbol of the wealthy enablers who had profited from Madoff's fraud. Another significant feeder fund case involved Fairfield Greenwich Group and its principals Walter Noel and Jeffrey Tucker, whose Fairfield Century Fund was the largest single feeder into Madoff's operation and which had conducted what appeared to be due diligence but had failed to verify crucial details about Madoff's operations or question obvious irregularities. After Madoff's arrest, it emerged that Fairfield Greenwich had not actually verified that trades Madoff claimed to be executing were really occurring, had not adequately investigated why Madoff's returns were so consistent, and had ignored warnings from its own chief risk officer about potential problems with the Madoff relationship. The trustee sued Fairfield Greenwich for approximately $3.5 billion, alleging that the firm had known or should have known that Madoff was running a fraud, and after years of litigation, Fairfield Greenwich settled in 2011 for approximately $1 billion, one of the largest recoveries in the Madoff liquidation. The firm effectively went out of business as a result of its Madoff exposure and the litigation that followed, and while principals like Noel and Tucker were not criminally charged, they faced intense criticism and their personal fortunes were significantly diminished by settlements and clawbacks. The most serious criminal case involving a Madoff feeder fund was that of Stanley Chase, a California money manager who had invested over $1 billion with Madoff and who had received over $270 million in profits from Madoff accounts over the years, money that the trustee alleged were fictitious profits from the Ponzi scheme that Chase should have recognized as suspicious. Chase was sued by the Madoff trustee and faced civil claims from investors, and the SEC charged him with fraud in 2009, alleging that he had deceived clients about his investment strategy and his relationship with Madoff. But before any resolution could be reached, Chase died in September 2010 at age 84, and his estate eventually settled with the trustee for $250 million. Another feeder fund operator who faced criminal charges was Jeffrey Pickauer, a Florida philanthropist and businessman whose foundation and personal accounts had invested with Madoff and who had withdrawn approximately $7 billion from his Madoff accounts over the years, the largest amount withdrawn by any Madoff investor and an amount that far exceeded what he had originally invested, leading the trustee to allege that Pickauer had either known about or been willfully blind to the fraud, and had essentially been complicit in perpetuating the scheme by continuing to invest and allowing his accounts to show enormous fictitious returns that helped attract other investors. The trustee filed suit seeking to recover the $7 billion, and while Pickauer denied any knowledge of fraud, he died suddenly in October 2009 before the case could proceed to trial, and his widow Barbara Pickauer reached a settlement in 2010 agreeing to forfeit $7.2 billion, the largest single forfeiture in American history, which became a major source of recovery for Madoff's victims. Some individuals went beyond merely operating feeder funds and actually worked inside Madoff's operation to facilitate the fraud, and these individuals faced criminal prosecution as co-conspirators in the Ponzi scheme itself. Frank DePascali, who worked for Madoff for over 30 years and served as the director of options trading and chief financial officer, though he never actually traded options or managed finances in any legitimate sense, was the person responsible for creating the false trading records and account statements that made the Ponzi scheme possible, and he supervised a small team in Madoff's 17th floor office who generated the fake documentation that showed clients their investments were growing when no actual investments existed. DePascali pleaded guilty in 2009 to 10 counts including conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, and tax offenses, and he admitted in court that he had known for decades that Madoff was not actually trading securities, and that the returns shown to clients were fictitious, stating, "I knew what I was doing was wrong, indeed criminal." DePascali agreed to cooperate with prosecutors and provided detailed testimony about how the scheme operated and who else had been involved, and while he faced up to 125 years in prison, he died of lung cancer in 2015 before being sentenced, denying victims the satisfaction of seeing him imprisoned. 5 other Madoff employees who worked in the operations that generated false records were also prosecuted, including Daniel Bonventre, who was the director of operations and who prosecutors said helped DePascali create false records, Annette Bongiorno and Joan Krupi, who worked in the investment advisory business managing client accounts and generating false statements, and computer programmers Jerome O'Hara and George Perez, who created software that automated the generation of fake trading records and who prosecutors said knew the trades were fictional. All 5 were convicted at trial in 2014 on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy, with evidence showing they had assisted in creating the false documentation that sustained the Ponzi scheme and that they had personally benefited through inflated salaries, bonuses, and in some cases fictitious investment returns in their own accounts. Bonventre was sentenced to 10 years in prison, Bongiorno to 6 years, Krupi to 6 years, and O'Hara and Perez to 2.5 years each, and all were ordered to forfeit millions of dollars. The prosecution of these employees was significant because it demonstrated that Madoff had not acted alone, as he had initially claimed, but had required a team of people to generate the massive amount of false documentation necessary to maintain the fraud across thousands of accounts, and it showed that multiple individuals had known the operation was fraudulent but had continued participating for years in exchange for money and job security. Peter Madoff, Bernard's younger brother who had worked at the firm for over 4 decades and served as senior managing director and chief compliance officer, pleaded guilty in 2012 to conspiracy and falsifying records, admitting that he had failed to implement required compliance procedures and had created false documents to deceive regulators, though he claimed not to have known about the Ponzi scheme until shortly before it collapsed, a claim prosecutors and many observers found doubtful, given his long tenure and senior position in the firm. Peter Madoff was sentenced to 10 years in prison and was ordered to forfeit $143 million, and he served his sentence and was released in August 2020. The various prosecutions and civil recoveries from feeder funds and Madoff employees and associates ultimately recovered approximately $14 billion of the approximately $18 billion in principal that investors had lost, a recovery rate that was unusually high for a fraud case, though still far short of the $65 billion in fictitious value that client statements had shown before the fraud collapsed. The feeder fund frauds and the prosecution of Madoff's enablers illustrated several important principles about how large-scale frauds operate and persist. First, that sophisticated investors and financial professionals can be deceived or can choose to ignore warning signs when they are profiting from relationships with fraudsters. Second, that due diligence and oversight are meaningful only if they are actually conducted rather than existing as paperwork exercises designed to provide cover. Third, that individuals who facilitate frauds, even if they didn't originate them, can face serious criminal and civil liability for their roles as enablers and accomplices. And fourth, that recovering assets after fraud collapses requires aggressive pursuit of everyone who benefited from the scheme, whether they were actively involved or merely profited from fictitious returns. The Madoff feeder fund cases also raised questions about the responsibility of financial professionals to their clients and about what level of diligence is required when investing client money with third-party managers, with the cases establishing that simply relying on a manager's reputation or past performance is not sufficient and that advisors must actually verify that investments are real and that the claim strategy is being implemented. The fact that so many sophisticated investors, fund managers, and institutions were deceived by or complicit in Madoff's fraud undermined confidence in the financial advisory industry and in the competence and integrity of those who hold themselves out as professional money managers, and it demonstrated that prestigious credentials, wealthy clients, and institutional affiliations provide no guarantee against fraud or incompetence. The prosecution of individuals like De Pascali and the 5 convicted employees showed that even lower-level participants in fraud schemes face serious consequences if they knowingly assist in criminal conduct, even if they are following orders from superiors or believe they are simply doing their jobs. And these cases reinforced the principle that individuals cannot escape responsibility for fraud by claiming they were just employees doing what they were told when they knew the conduct was illegal. The civil recoveries from Merkin, Fairfield Greenwich, the Pickhour estate, and others demonstrated the power of clawback litigation and fraudulent transfer laws that allow trustees to recover money from those who withdrew more from Ponzi schemes than they invested, even if the recipients believed the returns were legitimate, a legal principle that some critics argue is unfair to investors who acted in good faith but which others defend as necessary to ensure equal treatment of all fraud victims, by returning the pooled assets to be distributed fairly. The Madoff feeder fund saga remains a crucial part of the larger Madoff scandal and illustrates how massive frauds typically require not just one criminal mastermind but an ecosystem of enablers, facilitators, and those who are willfully blind to obvious red flags. And it serves as a warning that in finance as in other areas, those who profit from relationships with fraudsters can find themselves exposed to serious legal, financial, and reputational consequences when the fraud inevitably collapses, and that the responsibility to conduct meaningful due diligence and to question results that seem too good to be true applies to all financial professionals regardless of their clients' sophistication or the prestige of the investment managers they recommend. Number 9. The HealthSouth corporate fraud cooking the books in healthcare. HealthSouth Corporation, founded in 1984 by Richard Scrushy in Birmingham, Alabama, grew to become the largest publicly traded healthcare company in the United States, specializing in outpatient surgery and rehabilitative healthcare, operating over 2,000 facilities and employing more than 50,000 people by the early 2000s. But this impressive growth story concealed a massive accounting fraud that inflated the company's earnings by approximately $2.7 billion over a period of more than 6 years from 1996 through 2002, making it one of the largest corporate frauds in American history and ultimately leading to criminal convictions of 15 former HealthSouth executives, while Scrushy himself avoided criminal conviction on fraud charges in a controversial state court trial, only to be later convicted in a separate bribery case. The fraud at HealthSouth differed from some other major corporate frauds in that it was not driven primarily by complex financial instruments or special-purpose entities, but rather by straightforward falsification of accounting records, with finance department employees making systematic journal entries to inflate revenues and assets while reducing expenses, all in service of meeting Wall Street analyst expectations and maintaining the company's stock price, which enriched Scrushy and other executives who sold shares and exercised stock options based on the artificially inflated values. Richard Scrushy was a charismatic and domineering CEO who had built HealthSouth from a small operation into a healthcare empire through aggressive expansion and acquisition, and he cultivated a public image as a successful entrepreneur and generous philanthropist, while maintaining iron control over the company's operations and demanding that his finance team deliver the earnings numbers that analysts expected regardless of actual business performance. The fraud began in earnest in the mid-1990s when HealthSouth's actual earnings began falling short of analyst forecasts, and rather than report disappointing results and risk seeing the company's stock price decline, Scrushy and Chief Financial Officer Aaron Beam, along with other senior finance executives, made the decision to falsify the numbers through accounting manipulations. The scheme operated through what participants later described as a quarterly ritual where, after the books were closed for each quarter, senior finance executives would gather to compare actual results with analyst expectations, and when actual earnings fell short, which they consistently did by growing amounts as the fraud progressed, they would determine the size of the gap that needed to be filled and would direct accountants to make fictitious entries to inflate earnings by the necessary amount. These false entries typically involved creating fictitious contractual adjustments that increased revenue, recording fake increases in the value of property and equipment, or understating expenses, and the adjustments were often recorded in accounts that were not subject to detailed audit scrutiny and were spread across HealthSouth's many facilities to avoid detection. The fraud required the participation of numerous people in the finance department, and Scrushy and his CFOs created a culture where employees understood that making the numbers was mandatory regardless of whether they were real, and employees who raised objections were sidelined or terminated, while those who cooperated were rewarded with bonuses and promotions. The fraudulent earnings inflation allowed HealthSouth to report steady growth and profitability, even as its actual business faced competitive pressures and operational challenges. And this artificial success supported a stock price that peaked at over $30 per share, and that made Scrushy personally wealthy, with his compensation in some years exceeding $100 million when bonuses and stock option gains were included. Scrushy lived extravagantly with multiple mansions, a private jet, a large yacht, and an expensive lifestyle that included funding his own television talk show, and he surrounded himself with loyalists while maintaining tight control over information and access within the company. The fraud began to unravel in 2002 when the FBI, working with informants who had knowledge of HealthSouth's accounting practices, began investigating the company, and in March 2003, the investigation became public when the SEC filed civil fraud charges against HealthSouth and Scrushy, alleging that the company had overstated earnings by at least $1.4 billion, a number that would later be revised upward to $2.7 billion as the full scope of the fraud became clear. The announcement shocked the healthcare industry and the business community in Alabama, where HealthSouth was a major employer and Scrushy was a prominent figure, and the company's stock price immediately collapsed, falling from over $3 per share to pennies, wiping out most remaining shareholder value. Federal prosecutors moved quickly to build a criminal case, and they found willing cooperators among HealthSouth's finance executives, all of whom faced the prospect of lengthy prison sentences and most of whom concluded that their best option was to plead guilty and cooperate against Scrushy. 15 former HealthSouth executives ultimately pleaded guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges, including 5 former chief financial officers who had served in that role at various times during the fraud: Aaron Beam, who co-founded the company with Scrushy and served as the first CFO before leaving in 1997, Michael Martin, William Owens, Weston Smith, and Malcolm "Tad" McVeigh, all of whom admitted they had directed the falsification of financial statements at Scrushy's instruction or with his knowledge and approval. These former CFOs and other cooperating executives provided prosecutors with detailed testimony about how the fraud operated, who made decisions about the false entries, how Scrushy maintained control over the process, and how employees who objected were dealt with, and they described meetings where Scrushy was informed about the differences between actual results and reported results, and where he directed them to continue making whatever adjustments were necessary to hit the numbers. The cooperating witnesses' testimony painted a picture of Scrushy as the architect and primary beneficiary of the fraud, someone who knew exactly what was happening and who created the pressure that made subordinates feel they had no choice but to participate in the falsification. Richard Scrushy was indicted in November 2003 on 85 counts including fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and false statements, and his trial became one of the most closely watched white-collar prosecutions in years, particularly because it was held in Birmingham, Alabama, Scrushy's hometown, where he was well known and had cultivated relationships and a public image through philanthropy and media appearances. The trial began in January 2005 and lasted 6 months, making it one of the longest white-collar trials in federal court history, and prosecutors presented testimony from the 5 former CFOs and 10 other former HealthSouth executives, all of whom testified that Scrushy had directed or known about the accounting fraud and that they had participated in the scheme at his direction. The prosecution presented evidence of Scrushy's lavish lifestyle funded by proceeds from selling HealthSouth stock at artificially inflated prices, and they introduced recordings of earnings calls where Scrushy touted HealthSouth's financial performance that he knew was based on false numbers. Scrushy's defense, led by prominent white-collar attorney Donald Watkins and later by Art Leach and Jim Parkman after Watkins was replaced, argued that Scrushy had been an operational CEO who focused on building the business and had delegated financial matters to his CFOs, and that the 15 cooperating executives were lying to reduce their own sentences by falsely blaming Scrushy for fraud that they had perpetrated on their own. The defense attacked the credibility of prosecution witnesses by highlighting their admitted crimes and their incentives to provide testimony that would please prosecutors, and they presented character witnesses who testified about Scrushy's positive qualities and business accomplishments. The defense also emphasized Scrushy's roots in the Birmingham community and his contributions through employment and philanthropy. And Scrushy himself projected confidence throughout the trial, appearing daily with his wife and maintaining his innocence in media interviews. After more than 20 days of deliberation, the jury acquitted Scrushy on all 85 counts on June 28, 2005, a stunning defeat for federal prosecutors who had presented what they believed was overwhelming evidence of guilt through the testimony of 15 cooperating witnesses. The verdict was controversial and led to questions about whether Scrushy's local prominence and the defense strategy of appealing to regional pride and distrust of federal authorities had influenced the jury, and some observers noted that the jury included no accountants or individuals with significant business experience who might have better understood the financial evidence. Others suggested that the prosecution's case had been weakened by the number of cooperating witnesses all testifying similarly, which may have seemed rehearsed or coordinated to jurors, and that the technical nature of accounting fraud made it difficult for jurors to understand exactly what Scrushy was alleged to have done wrong. Despite his acquittal on the fraud charges, Scrushy's legal troubles were far from over, and in 2006, he was indicted along with former Alabama Governor Don Siegelman on federal bribery and corruption charges, alleging that Scrushy had arranged for HealthSouth to pay $250,000 to a political organization supporting a state lottery in exchange for Siegelman appointing Scrushy to a state hospital regulatory board, and that this arrangement constituted bribery under federal honest services fraud statutes. Scrushy and Siegelman were tried together in Montgomery, Alabama, federal court in 2006, and both were convicted on multiple counts of bribery, conspiracy, and honest services fraud, though some counts were dismissed or overturned on appeal. Scrushy was sentenced in June 2007 to 6 years and 10 months in federal prison and was ordered to pay nearly $2.9 million in fines and restitution, and he entered federal custody in July 2007 to begin serving his sentence. The conviction and sentence meant that while Scrushy had escaped accountability for the massive accounting fraud at HealthSouth, He was ultimately imprisoned for corruption charges related to his attempt to influence state healthcare policy through what prosecutors characterized as bribing a governor. Scrushy served his sentence at federal facilities and was released from a halfway house in July 2012 after serving approximately 5 years. And he was also ordered to pay $82 million in restitution to HealthSouth shareholders in a separate civil case brought by the SEC, though his ability to pay this judgment was limited given that most of his assets had been seized or were subject to other claims. The 15 former HealthSouth executives who cooperated with prosecutors received varying sentences based on their level of cooperation and their roles in the fraud, with most receiving prison terms ranging from probationary sentences to 5 years, significantly less than they would have faced without cooperation agreements. Former CFO William Owens, who provided particularly detailed and useful testimony, received 28 months in prison, while former CFO Weston Smith received 27 months, and others received similar terms, all far less than the decades they could have faced if convicted at trial of all charges. HealthSouth itself survived the scandal through a complex restructuring and the installation of new management that cooperated fully with investigations and worked to restore the company's financial reporting integrity and operational credibility. The company was delisted from the New York Stock Exchange and faced numerous shareholder lawsuits and regulatory actions, but it managed to avoid bankruptcy and eventually returned to profitability under new leadership. In 2009, HealthSouth reached a settlement with the SEC agreeing to pay $100 million to resolve civil charges related to the accounting fraud. And the company also paid substantial settlements to shareholders who sued over losses incurred due to the inflated stock price. The company was eventually rebranded as Encompass Health in 2018 as part of an effort to move beyond its association with the Scrushy-era fraud. The HealthSouth fraud case illustrated several important aspects of corporate fraud and its prosecution. First, that frauds can involve straightforward falsification of numbers rather than complex financial engineering, and that such frauds can grow to enormous size when perpetrated systematically over years and when corporate culture discourages challenge of senior management. Second, the case showed the importance of cooperating witnesses in building fraud cases, as the 15 guilty pleas and cooperation agreements provided prosecutors with insider testimony that was essential to understanding how the fraud operated and who was responsible. Though the Scrushy acquittal also demonstrated that even extensive cooperating witness testimony may not be sufficient for conviction if jurors are skeptical of witness motivations or if the case is tried in a venue where the defendant has local support. Third, the case highlighted how local prominence and community ties can affect criminal prosecutions, with Scrushy's acquittal in Birmingham contrasting with his conviction in Montgomery where he had less local influence, raising questions about venue selection and jury composition in white-collar cases. Fourth, the HealthSouth fraud demonstrated how corporate frauds harm not just distant investors but also employees and communities, as thousands of HealthSouth workers faced uncertainty about their jobs and the company's viability when the fraud was revealed, and Birmingham's economy and civic reputation were damaged by association with such a massive scandal. The case also illustrated the limitations of auditing and regulatory oversight, as HealthSouth's external auditor Ernst & Young conducted annual audits without detecting the massive earnings inflation, raising questions about audit quality and about what auditors should be expected to find when determined management is committing fraud, and Ernst & Young later paid $245 million to settle civil claims related to its failure to detect the fraud, though it did not admit wrongdoing. The fraud occurred despite Sarbanes-Oxley requirements for enhanced internal controls and CEO/CFO certification of financial statements, as the fraud was ongoing when those requirements took effect in 2002. Suggesting that even enhanced regulatory frameworks cannot prevent fraud when senior management is determined to falsify numbers and can intimidate or incentivize subordinates to cooperate. Richard Scrushy remained defiant after his release from prison, continuing to maintain his innocence on the HealthSouth fraud charges and suggesting that he had been unfairly targeted by prosecutors. And he attempted to rebuild his reputation and business career, though with limited success, given his criminal conviction and the restitution judgments outstanding against him. The 15 cooperating former executives largely disappeared from public life after serving their sentences, with many facing continuing financial and personal consequences from their roles in the fraud despite their reduced sentences. The HealthSouth fraud remains an important case study in corporate governance, accounting fraud, prosecutorial strategy, and the challenges of holding CEOs accountable when they can claim ignorance of details while creating pressure on subordinates to deliver results by any means necessary. And it serves as a reminder that fraud can flourish in healthcare and other supposedly mission-driven industries just as in finance or telecommunications, and that maintaining ethical corporate cultures and effective internal controls requires vigilance and willingness to challenge authority when something appears wrong. Number 10. The Wirecard scandal. Germany's tech darling, built on fabricated revenues. Wirecard AG was a German payment processing and financial services company that rose from obscurity to become one of Germany's most valuable technology companies, with a market capitalization exceeding 24 billion euros and admission to Germany's prestigious DAX stock index in 2018, replacing Commerzbank and standing alongside corporate giants like Volkswagen and Siemens. But this spectacular success story was built on fabricated revenues and phantom assets that existed only in false accounting records, making Wirecard the largest fraud in German corporate history and a spectacular failure of auditing, regulation, and oversight that shocked the country's business establishment and raised profound questions about how such a massive fraud could have persisted for years despite numerous warning signs and journalistic exposés that were dismissed or ignored by regulators and investors. Wirecard's business purportedly involved processing electronic payments for merchants and issuing prepaid cards and other financial products, and it positioned itself as a technology company disrupting traditional financial services, which allowed it to command high stock valuations based on projected growth even as skeptics questioned how the company generated its claimed revenues and profits. The fraud centered on Wirecard's Asian operations, where the company claimed to be processing enormous volumes of transactions for major merchants through third-party partners. And these Asian operations supposedly generated billions of euros in revenues and held cash balances of more than 1.9 billion euros that were held in trust accounts at banks in the Philippines and elsewhere. But in reality, these transactions were largely or entirely fabricated. The cash did not exist, and the revenues were fictitious entries designed to create the appearance of a successful, fast-growing business when the actual operations were far smaller and less profitable than claimed. The fraud was orchestrated primarily by CEO Markus Braun, an Austrian entrepreneur who had joined Wirecard in 2002 and transformed it from a small payment processor into what appeared to be a global fintech powerhouse, and by Chief Operating Officer Jan Marsalek, a mysterious figure who oversaw the Asian operations and who fled Germany when the fraud was exposed and remains a fugitive believed to be hiding in Russia with possible intelligence connections. Braun and Marsalek maintained tight control over information about Wirecard's Asian business, restricting access to operational details and using the geographic distance and supposed complexity of the Asian markets to deflect questions about how the business actually worked, and they cultivated relationships with prominent politicians, business leaders, and investors who lent credibility to the company and helped deflect criticism. For years, Wirecard's growth story attracted enthusiastic support from investors and analysts who viewed it as Germany's answer to successful American tech companies. And its stock price rose steadily even as short sellers and journalists published research and investigations questioning the company's accounting and alleging fraud. Financial Times journalist Dan McCrum published a series of detailed articles beginning in 2015 that exposed suspicious transactions, questionable business practices, and evidence that Wirecard's revenues in Singapore and other Asian locations were exaggerated or fabricated. And McCrum's reporting included leaked documents, whistleblower accounts, and analysis of corporate records that should have prompted serious regulatory investigation. But instead, Wirecard responded by attacking the journalists and alleging a conspiracy of short sellers trying to manipulate the stock price, and German regulators actually investigated the Financial Times and the short sellers rather than thoroughly investigating Wirecard itself, with Germany's financial regulator BaFin even temporarily banning short selling of Wirecard stock in 2019 to prevent what it viewed as market manipulation, a decision that in retrospect protected the fraud from scrutiny and allowed it to continue longer. Wirecard's auditor, EY Ernst & Young, conducted annual audits and issued unqualified opinions on the company's financial statements despite the mounting evidence of irregularities, and EY's failure to detect or adequately investigate the fraud has become one of the most significant auditing failures in history, raising questions about the effectiveness of audits and the independence and competence of major audit firms. The fraud finally unraveled in 2020 when EY, preparing its audit of Wirecard's 2019 financial statements and facing pressure from regulators to verify the existence of the cash balances claimed to be held in trust accounts, insisted on receiving direct confirmation from the banks where the money was supposedly held, And when those confirmations were requested, the banks in the Philippines and elsewhere either could not provide them or provided documents that were determined to be forgeries, and it became clear that the 1.9 billion euros simply did not exist. On June 18, 2020, Wirecard announced that the cash balances were missing and might not exist, a disclosure that caused the stock to collapse and the company to face imminent insolvency. And within days, Wirecard filed for insolvency. Markus Braun resigned as CEO and was arrested by German police, and the scale of the fraud began to emerge as investigators examined the company's records and as employees and partners provided information about how the false transactions had been created. Braun was charged with fraud, breach of trust, and market manipulation, and prosecutors alleged that he had been aware of and had directed the falsification of revenues and the creation of phantom assets. Though Braun maintained that he had been deceived by others in the company, particularly Marsalek, and that he had believed the Asian business was real until shortly before the collapse. Jan Marsalek disappeared on June 19, 2020, and investigators later determined that he had fled to Austria and then apparently traveled to Belarus and Russia with assistance that suggested possible intelligence connections. And he remains a fugitive with an international arrest warrant, though German prosecutors believe he is beyond their reach in Russia. The investigation into Wirecard expanded to uncover a complex web of accomplices, forged documents, and circular transactions designed to create the appearance of legitimate business activity. And it emerged that Wirecard had used a network of third-party partners and dubious entities to generate fake invoices and payment records that supported the claimed revenues, and that employees in the Philippines and elsewhere had created false bank statements and other documents at the direction of senior management. Several former Wirecard executives and employees were arrested and charged, including Oliver Bellenhaus, a former managing director in Wirecard's Dubai office who became a key witness and cooperator, providing detailed testimony about how the fraud operated and implicating Braun and Marsalek in the scheme. Bellenhaus testified that he had participated in creating false invoices and circular money flows designed to make it appear that Wirecard was processing large volumes of transactions when in reality the money was simply being moved through a series of accounts and then returned, creating the illusion of business activity without any actual underlying economic substance. And he described meetings where senior executives, including Marsalek, discussed how to maintain the fraud and avoid detection. The trial of Markus Braun began in December 2022 in Munich and has become one of Germany's largest and most complex criminal trials, with proceedings expected to last several years given the volume of evidence and the number of witnesses. And Braun has maintained his innocence throughout, arguing that he was misled by Marsalek and other subordinates about the true state of the Asian business and that he acted in good faith based on information provided to him, though prosecutors have presented evidence including internal communications and witness testimony that they argue shows Braun was fully aware of the fraud and actively participated in directing it. The prosecution's case includes testimony from cooperating witnesses, analysis of financial records and communications, and evidence of transactions that prosecutors say could only have been designed to deceive auditors and investors. And they argue that as CEO, Braun had access to information that should have made it clear the claimed revenues and assets were not real. Other former Wirecard executives have also been charged or are under investigation, including the former chief financial officer and the former chief legal officer, both of whom prosecutors believe played roles in maintaining the fraud or at minimum failed to fulfill their oversight responsibilities. The victims of the Wirecard fraud include investors who lost billions of euros when the stock collapsed to nearly zero, creditors who are unlikely to recover significant amounts in the insolvency proceedings, and employees who lost jobs and in many cases had invested their own savings in Wirecard stock believing in the company's future. The fraud also caused significant reputational damage to Germany's financial regulatory system and to its auditing profession, as critics pointed out that BaFin had been more aggressive in investigating journalists and short sellers who questioned Wirecard than in investigating the company itself despite numerous red flags, and that EY had issued clean audit opinions year after year despite what should have been obvious inconsistencies and despite the growing public evidence that something was wrong with Wirecard's accounting. BaFin's president Felix Heufeld resigned in the wake of the scandal after admitting to failures in oversight, and the agency has been restructured and given enhanced powers, though critics argue that more fundamental reforms are needed. EY has faced massive civil litigation from Wirecard investors and creditors seeking to hold the auditor accountable for failing to detect the fraud, And while EY maintains that it was also deceived by sophisticated forgeries and by management's deliberate concealment of information, critics argue that basic audit procedures should have identified the problems years earlier if EY had been appropriately skeptical and thorough. In 2021, German prosecutors raided EY's offices and opened a criminal investigation into whether EY auditors had been negligent or complicit in allowing the fraud to continue, and that investigation remains ongoing. The German government responded to the Wirecard scandal by launching reforms to financial regulation and auditing oversight, including requiring more frequent rotation of audit firms, increasing regulatory powers to investigate potential fraud, and creating enhanced reporting requirements for companies, though whether these reforms will prevent future frauds remains to be seen. The Wirecard case has been compared to other major frauds including Enron and Theranos, and it shares some common features including a charismatic leader who cultivated powerful relationships, a business model that was complex and difficult for outsiders to verify, auditors who failed to maintain appropriate skepticism, regulators who were ineffective or who sided with the company against critics, and a market environment that rewarded growth stories and punished skepticism. What makes Wirecard particularly notable is that it occurred in Germany, a country that prides itself on corporate governance and regulatory rigor, and at a company that was considered a flagship of Germany's technology sector, and that was held up as an example of how traditional German industries could be disrupted by innovative startups. The fact that such a massive fraud could persist for years at a DAX-listed company despite investigative journalism, short-seller research, and whistleblower accounts that should have prompted thorough investigation represents a systemic failure that has damaged confidence in German financial markets and corporate oversight. The role of politicians and regulators in defending Wirecard against critics, and in failing to investigate seriously when evidence of problems emerged, has been particularly controversial, with critics arguing that Wirecard benefited from political connections and from a desire by German authorities to support a perceived national tech champion, rather than subject it to the scrutiny that should have been applied regardless of the company's prominence or economic importance. Jan Marsalek's disappearance and apparent refuge in Russia has added an international espionage dimension to the scandal, as investigators have explored whether Wirecard's business operations in certain countries may have involved intelligence activities or money laundering beyond the fraud against investors, and whether Marsalek's connections to Russian intelligence services may have facilitated both the fraud itself and his escape from prosecution. The Wirecard scandal remains active as of 2024 with Marcus Braun's trial ongoing, with civil litigation against EY proceeding, with continuing efforts to locate Marsalek and recover assets, and with reforms being implemented to try to prevent similar frauds. And it serves as a powerful reminder that sophisticated corporate frauds can occur in any country and any industry when oversight fails, when auditors are not sufficiently independent or skeptical, when regulators are captured by the industries they oversee or by political pressures, and when market participants prioritize growth narratives over fundamental analysis and evidence-based skepticism. And the case illustrates how frauds can be sustained through a combination of complex business structures, geographic distance, aggressive attacks on critics, cultivation of political and investor support, and exploitation of confirmation bias that leads people to believe what they want to believe about successful companies rather than seriously examining evidence that contradicts the official story.